you guys told me that that this would be about storytelling as it relates to journalism. So I made some notes. So I hope थोड़ा सा lecture के जैसे लगेगा, but I'm so used to teaching. I've been teaching all my life. So
we do need teaching. Please feel free to, let it be a master class.
It'll be a class. I hope it's a master something or the other. So you're absolutely right. So the way it works for me, that I always start with character, right? When you're writing fiction, you have the freedom to do this. So what I mean by starting with character is that I don't know who these people are who are appearing to me in a very hazy kind of way. So for instance, with Sacred Games, I knew Sartaj because I'd written one short story about him in Love and Longing in Bombay. But when I started, all I knew at the beginning was that he's standing outside this strange house in the northern suburbs of Bombay. And it looks like a bunker, and he's talking to one gangster who's inside, speaker pe. And I had no idea like who that guy was. And then what I do is I start asking questions about all of these people. Matlab, who are they? What is their backstory? Right? What do they look like? And they slowly start to appear to me. So I guess in journalism, the equivalent would be like going and meeting somebody who's going to maybe be the center of the story and trying to figure them out, right? So in terms of my process, then what happens is once I start investigating the character and know a little bit more about him or her, the most important thing becomes, what does this person want at this point in their life, right? What do they really, really want? What do they really desire? And second, out of that comes, what is preventing them from getting that desire, right? What are the obstacles that are standing in the way? And then as soon as I know that, it's like a tube light goes on, right? Because then I know what the conflict of the story is going to be, right? You have desire, you have obstacle, so therefore you have conflict, right? And in the fiction writing business, there's a very old, like it's a formula that I write on the board in classes. It's an equation. I write desire plus danger equals drama, right? So you have desire, and then whatever that person is going to do to get towards that fulfillment of that desire is somehow dangerous. That doesn't mean it has to be physical or always like, shootouts must happen, but there's got to be something serious stopping the character from getting that, right? So I don't know how much of this transfers to journalistic writing or writing based on like real stuff, but in the narrative writing, in the journalist writing, especially investigative reporting that I've seen, when I look at the story and think about why did this affect me so strongly, I see these same techniques are deployed, right? Okay, so then I'm sorry, I'm going on. Any questions or like, was that kind of clear?
Yes, I think it was crystal clear. Thank you, and very useful for us.
Right. So then, okay, so then there's a couple of things that I also talk, and I use this a lot in my own writing. One is this old principle that has been expressed for centuries. In Latin, they say, in medias res, right? Start in the middle, right? So all that backstory and the exposition that might be useful to you in writing the story and especially later in the story, but start the story in the middle, right? Meaning that leave that exposition for later on. Thoda drama bhar ke pehla scene jo na hai, that must be kind of dramatic, right? And then dramatic in the sense that you have a sense of curiosity. The reader or the viewer has a sense of curiosity about what is going on here, right? What is going to happen next, right? Okay, so then we move from there, right? And then as you develop the narrative, you start describing not only the characters, but the landscape, right? And you try and create a sense of mood, right? By depicting what the character is doing. And how you do this, I think, is through detail, right? Matlab, you have to show to the reader in some sense who this person is, right? And so it might be innocuous things. It might be a detail about their clothing or how they hold a cigarette, right? But and great actors, you will notice, will do this on screen also, right? Or on stage. There will be something, they'll catch a mannerism, they'll have a method of standing or a way of standing that then, you really get drawn into, and you feel like I know this person somehow, right? I am empathizing with this person, even though they might be a very bad person, right? But the job of the writer, I think in both fiction and journalism, is to even make us kind of understand the bad people, right? Or the ambiguous people, the gray people. And I should emphasize here that empathy is not forgiveness, right? You don't need to forgive somebody for the evil they have done or doing, but a way of understanding why they are the way they are is to empathize, right? Or to at least to like have some notion of why they are the way they are. So detail becomes really important, right? And it shouldn't be like an overwhelming mass of detail, right? Often, sometimes in fiction, and I've seen this also done in nonfiction, you'll see, he had black hair, blue eyes, broad shoulders, and top down say like it'll be a list, right? And that the reader will start to notice, and that is not a good thing, right? So you have to pick out a few precise details that somehow carry the essence of that person, right? It might be his or her car, right? Like I was saying, the cigarette they're smoking, the brands that they wear, right? Something like that. So one of the people that I learned a lot about this from reading this was Ernest Hemingway's fiction, right? And actually his non-fiction writing too. And what is really interesting about him is that Hemingway, after he finished high school, his first job was as a cub reporter at the Kansas City Star newspaper, right? And from there, he learned this art in the very, you have, as you all know, especially in newspaper writing, you have a short space, and you've got to get across that person, what the story is about, in a very confined, economical way, right? So he learned to do that, and and then he used this learning in his fiction all his life, that how with a few details you can convey a sense of who the person is, what the landscape they're moving in, and all of that. And so then also it's been pointed out that the Kansas City Star's style guide that they gave to all their reporters says, use short sentences, use short first paragraphs, use vigorous English, be positive, not negative. Positive in the sense of have um, use positive language in the sense of active language, right? So instead of saying he was hit by the truck, you say the truck hit him, right? Which it's a more direct way and has more energy of expressing the same meaning, right? And so, I mean, I don't think you necessarily need to buy into the short sentences and the short paragraphs, because I write sometimes very long sentences and very long paragraphs, but understanding how your language is attaching to the reader's attention and how it's conveying a sense of mood and place, I think that's very important, right? So then you've got your character, you have a protagonist, as it were. You might have antagonists of several, or it might be a force of nature, right? You're writing a story about a group of climbers trying to climb Kanchenjunga, right? So you have that as a nature, in that case, becomes the antagonist. So you have the conflict going, and then usually in fiction, you'll notice that the conflict rises in an arc, right? So if the classical plays are structured in, first act, then the second act is long, and then the third act is again short, right? And the second act is where the tension in the story keeps rising in an arc upwards, right? And what that arc is composed of is that the protagonist first tries one thing to overcome an obstacle, and then he or she overcomes that obstacle, or either is defeated by it, and then they try another method, right? And each step in this path is more and more difficult, right? So it's a fairly artificial arrangement. Real life doesn't proceed like this, right? But in fiction, in film, in drama, you can do this, and it's very effective in engaging our attention, right? And then what the climax of the story is usually is when the protagonist finally reaches a situation when they face a situation where they either emerge with victory or defeat, right? Matlab, final victory or defeat. right? So depending on whether it's the hero or the heroine wins, or it's going to be a tragedy of some sort, right? Dilip Kumar Saab, at the end of the film dies, right, in a very tragic fashion, right? So then you have this arc like this, right? So again, in journalism, you don't have the freedom and often the space, I think, to construct this arc, right? So, but I think still being aware of the shape of the conflict can be very effective, right? So how you construct the segments of the narrative, right? Each little burst of tension that you give to the reader along the way, then it's very important to give little periods of rest as well, right? Because if you have an action movie in which you get one explosion after another for 2.5 hours, you'll just get a headache, right? And you'll want to leave the theater halfway. So between each action sequence, you'll notice that there'll be a little period where the action will pause and something else will happen, right? You'll have the meeting with the lover, you'll have the family, getting together, something like that. Okay, let me just look at my notes. Uh, the other thing that you do a lot in my writing, and like especially I'm very aware of this in later revisions, not so much in the first draft or second draft, is that you alternate scene and summary, right? So that sometimes you have people directly talking to each other. You say, he said, "Give me a cigarette," and she said, "I don't have one," right? So there you're getting direct dialogue, and people are acting on each other. They're doing things to each other through dialogue and action. And then sometimes you need to, what I like to do is to pause that and then then they travel from, Bombay to Pune. And on the way, it was monsoon and the clouds were gathering over the ghats, that kind of thing. So that can also create a nice rhythm. So I think one way to think about it is that creating narrative is a very musical act. It's all about rhythm, if that makes any sense, right? You have to set up this kind of up and down rhythmic thing, and the reader or viewer, without knowing it, will get engaged by this, right? And it's a terrific way of engaging sympathy, empathy, attention, right? It draws our attention just like music does, right? If you notice a discordant note in a piece of music, it really throws you out, right? If the rhythm suddenly breaks. So one way to think of it is, very architecturally like that, right? What is the shape of the story? And in my head, I often imagine these blocks of storytelling, right? Uh, and in class, often we do this. We draw out the shape of the story. We draw this arc. We divide up the arc, right, into various segments, and we think about it. And it's, I shouldn't make it sound like a mathematical exercise. It's also ruled by instinct, right? But you combine the two things, analysis and instinct, together. Okay, so then what else? So one other thing which is very effective in fiction, and I think it happens a lot in real life also, is that if a character is going through, or a person is going through intense conflict, which matters to them, by the end of it, they will be changed somehow, right? So showing the reader how a person is changed by what they go through, by what you're depicting as the conflict in the story, I think that is very important and very satisfying in a dramatic way, but also makes sense to us as human beings, right? Like whether it's good or bad, whether they do good or bad, whatever happens to them is going to transform them somehow, right? And we like to see that, right? And if you think of all the great movies, the great novels that you've read, you'll see this principle in action, right? You'll see how the writer manages this and gets this done. So I should also say that in some kinds of stories, like mystery stories, detective stories, around the time of the climax is also when the reveal happens, right? What is the solution to the mystery? Who is the murderer? Right? Does that make sense? Right? Like I just watched Bulbul, which I liked a lot, and you'll notice how at the end the twist is revealed. I don't want to give away spoilers, but like, who is the Diane? Right? What is she? What does that mean? All of that is revealed towards the end, and again, that's very satisfying. Now, in in non-fictional forms, again, reality constrains us, right? In some mysteries in real life are never going to get solved. You can only present the puzzle and not the solution. But even that can be very satisfying, right? If you leave the reader at the end with a question or some important questions about what you've just depicted, that can be really, really great for the reader. And I really enjoy reading that kind of investigative journalism, right? Whether a solution is presented to me at the end or not, right? Because the mystery is what, the curiosity is what draws us in. That said, I think one thing that I've always loved reading mysteries and detective fiction. And what I've noticed is that it's an extremely useful form for exploring an entire culture, right? And I think that's why it has translated so rapidly and so well around the world in the last couple of centuries, right? We've been writing modern detective fiction in India, like for a couple of centuries, right? With some very famous examples, Satyajit Ray in Bengal and so on. So what you can do in a detective fiction is that you start, classically with a dead body, right? And the detective says, why is this body dead? Right? And often the dead body is that of an outsider, right? It's somebody who's poor, who doesn't have political power, right? And when the detective starts to investigate this, he or she discovers that that dead person had connections that go spread outwards and often upwards, right? So the first suspect might be the district collector's son, right? And then once you investigate that, he'll discover the politics of like that community, whatever that is, right? And so what you're doing is you're moving upward through the layers of a town or a city or an entire culture, but then you're also moving across, right? How does corruption spread across a culture? How do those networks work? And that was what happened to me in Sacred Games, right? I thought I was writing a very simple murder mystery set in gangland, right? Dead body, who was the killer, right? But then as soon as I started thinking about it and talking to people and investigating a little, it became very obvious to me that you can't write about organized crime anywhere in the world today without talking about politics, right? Because politics and organized crime go hand in hand, right? Organized crime cannot exist without the collusion of the local political system, right? And there's an exchange of values that goes on, of value, right? Of that goes on between the two worlds, which are often, they're not even two worlds, they're very interconnected to the point that sometimes it becomes hard to distinguish what am I doing in which part of the world am I in. And then that spreads, right? So you can't talk about politics today in anywhere in the world today without talking about religion. And soon, and that's very satisfying to the reader. And what I also find really amazing about detective fiction is that often once you read a detective novel or watch a detective film, you get educated about a particular vertical of culture, of society, right? So there are all these like novels with the titles like Who's Killing the Most Famous Cooks of Europe? Right? And it'll be a thing about the world of like high level chefs. And the mystery will be one of these chefs get murdered. And like the three suspects are other rival chefs, and then two are critics, and one is a waiter, right? And by the time you get through the end of the novel, you know something at least. You feel like you've learned something about this world that you might not have known before, right? So that kind of investigative reporting of a particular milieu, I think, is really amazing, right? In terms of um, just like informing the reader, right? And taking the reader into a landscape that he or she doesn't know about. But I should say that the kinds of writing or narrative construction that I do, I am given the ability to bring closure to the reader, right? At the end of my novel, the reader knows like why something happened, like who did what to whom, right? Like at the end of Sacred Games. But I think in journalistic writing, like I was saying, you often don't have that ability, right? Because reality is much messier. It's much more ambiguous. Like I was saying, you often don't know the answers. So that's why I think I've written very little nonfiction in my life, and it kind of frightens me, right? Because I feel like, hey, how do you do this, when you don't have the ability to make up things right and left, right? I might base my stuff in reality, draw inspiration from reality, but I don't have to obey reality. But what was very interesting to me was, I think about like 8 years ago, I had a journalist, an Indian guy who had worked as a crime journalist for a couple of national newspapers in New Delhi. He had done reporting in Kashmir, and then he came over here for I think it was a year-long program, and at the journalism school here at Berkeley, and he ended up in my graduate writing workshop. And so we were working on the first story that they were working on. The students were within the first month of the class, and he started writing, and he brought in like a little section of the beginning of a story, and I loved it, right? Because it was engaging and it was exciting and it was very dramatic in the way that I like. There's a guy who's just escaped from a prison. He's running down the road, and I said, "Man, this is awesome. You've got to continue this. I want to know what happens next." And then the workshop finished. We left class, and he hurried after me in the corridor, and he said, "Listen, I'm very scared." So I said, "What are you scared of? You've got a great beginning of a story." And he said, "But I don't know, anything can happen next." Right? And I said, "Well, that's the pleasure of writing fiction. You can take this guy anywhere you want and have anything happen to him." But he said, "No, but I'm not used to doing that," right? Because in his previous life or his continuing life as a journalist, the facts told him where to go, right? They guided him. They were like a series of markers. So I realized that the grass is always like, maybe the other side of the fence is always a bit crazier because it seems unknown to you. But that was very educational to me. And then I guess, like, to take away from theory and the abstract, there's two pieces of really great narrative writing, book writing, non-fiction writing that I've read recently that many of you guys might have read this. One is a book called Bad Blood by John Carreyrou. I hope I'm pronouncing his last name right. Carreyrou. And the novel is called the book is called Bad Blood. And it's about this ongoing but very famous, I guess you could call it an ongoing huge scam that went on in the tech industry here in Silicon Valley. So there's this very young woman named Elizabeth Holmes. She was a Holmes. She was a undergrad student at Stanford, very bright and very charismatic. And she dropped out of Stanford, I believe, in her first year when she was 18, because she was convinced she could revolutionize modern medicine by inventing this diagnostic tool that, instead of taking a big blood draw for blood testing, it would prick your finger. It would take a little drop of blood and run like 30 tests on that, right? Which would seem like science fiction. But then she somehow convinced these huge tech industries guys, VCs, and they gave her hundreds of millions of dollars. And I won't tell you much more of the story because the book reads like a thriller, right? Because you're like, how is this happening? What is happening? But finally, the whole thing fell apart, right? Because finally, the company couldn't deliver what they promised. So John Carreyrou started first doing these long investigative pieces in the New Yorker magazine. So if you do a search for New Yorker, John Carreyrou, Elizabeth Holmes, you'll find these stories immediately. And then he wrote up this whole story about it. And again, in terms of all these narrative techniques that I've been talking about, it's a masterclass in how to write good investigative nonfiction that is densely reported, right? It's well sourced. It is fact-based, but it's also atmospheric and convincing. By the end, you get a real sense of who these people are. And then, like I was saying, in terms of exploration of a culture, Elizabeth Holmes also came from a wealthy, very privileged, well-connected family, right? So he also shows you how these networks of privilege and class can bring you it allows you to run these kind of scams, right? She had these internationally famous guys, George Shultz, who I think was the Secretary of State of the US at some point, becomes a member of a board and like a big supporter of her. And by doing that, you get a kind of education in how Silicon Valley works and so forth, right? So I would recommend reading that, and then reading also his reporting on the Elizabeth Holmes that he had done before he wrote the book. The other book, I should say, I've been reading a lot about this because I've become involved. I'm the co-founder of a software startup, and we are building tools, a writing tool called Granthika, which makes writing books much easier for the writer, right? And I can talk about it more if you guys want. So I've been reading a lot, and then there's a book by Anna Weiner, Weiner, which is a memoir, which is a very different kind of book. It's much more impressionistic and literary in a sense. It's called Uncanny Valley, right? And it's about she's a young magazine writer with literary ambitions in New York, and somehow through a series of coincidences, she ends up in San Francisco and works for some of the biggest tech companies in the world. So that's a kind of very sociological but emotional reporting on her own experience in the tech industry. So in my mind, they became two recent examples of like writing about similar subjects, but using two different but related methods to get at the truth, as it were. So anyway, that's my spiel. How much time did I take for that? Not too long, I hope. So please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think this was very useful. Perhaps journalists come across many stories that have these components that you talked about, that there is a strong desire, there is a conflict, there is transformation, that character arc, and there is a definite resolution. But then I think we fail to identify those components because we are not looking for them. Yeah. As Rajan mentioned, that we have been taught to answer 5 W's and 1 H, and everything
wait, tell
else.
me those again. I think I know those. What is that? What is this?
Yeah, it's like who, what, where, when, and how.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So if we I explored, I'm sure we would find these components in most of the stories that we do. And also we fail to give importance to the structure of a story. How am I structuring it? So if we identify, perhaps, as you rightly mentioned, that we need to look for these components, and we looked at the structure, how do we structure our stories? If we worked harder on that, I think we would be in a position to do good narrative nonfiction. I can see 2 hands raised.
One sec. Let me just respond to what you just said. So I often tell in our discussions, I often talk about how what you're talking about, these are like building blocks, right? One of the ways that I like to describe them is that it's a pattern language, right? And pattern language actually comes from an architect. The phrase pattern language, it comes from an architect named Christopher Alexander. And he wrote a couple of very famous architecture books in the 70s in which he talked about this. And what he said is that, look, in constructing architecture that human beings, that encourages us being human, right, in which we can live and thrive, we often face the same problems, right? So you have a certain environment, weather, and then the question is, how do you make a home in the middle of this environment and a town in the middle of this environment that actually thrives, right, in human terms, right, not just in economic terms? So he said, okay, let's think about certain things. What are the solutions to these problems? And then identify the common components, and we'll say that this is a pattern that we can use. Right. So if you're in North India, for instance, you all must have seen those old-fashioned houses. My grandfather's house was like this. You have an open yard in the center of the house, right? So you come in the front, there'll be a little open area. Then there'll be a sort of couple of 2-3 rooms in front. You'll walk through a passageway, and then you'll come upon a big square. In the middle, there might be a tree, and there'll be houses all around that, right? Especially the old Haveli type houses used to be constructed like this. So why is that? Because of the weather, right? Because it suits us. We want privacy. Then the chat pe, you want in the winter to sleep on the sun. So the roofs will be constructed in a certain way. So you can think of narrative techniques in the same sense, right? You have character, you have conflict, you have language, you have rhythm, right? You have these structures. And once you start to identify them, like you said, then you can start thinking of them as blocks, right? Like, how do I use these patterns for this particular story in which I'm facing this particular problem? And then it also becomes, once you have this pattern language, among writers, we do this all the time. Filmmakers, we do this all the time. It becomes a common way to talk, right? So if I'm talking to, let's say, Vikramaditya Motwani and Varun Grover about a script, and we're talking about the draft of an episode, I can tell them, like, I think, listen, in the second act of this, I think there's a little slack of tension. Could we do this over here, right? We reduce the size of this scene to then, do this or whatever. And all of us know what we're talking about because we're sharing the same language, right? So it's a way of also cutting through a lot of, I don't know, otherwise fuzzy language, right? Because none of us know what we're talking about. Just like the principles that you just said, right? That's also a pattern language in which somebody's trying to say, this are the requirements of a traditional journalistic story. This is what you must do, right?
I am like recently I have released one of my international album as composer and lyricist that is called Collection of Lullaby. The name is Rabse. And I'm a writer too. I've been writing for audio, but right now I'm trying my hand in screenplay, so I was struggling. And I'm writing a crime-based audio series, Women in the Crime World.
Oh, wow.
So I don't know. So I'm not able to understand when you write a docudrama, wherein आपको drama भी रखना है और जो documentary facts हैं किसी की life के उसको भी उतना ही जिंदा रखना है. So how do we strike that balance कि मतलब जो कहानी है वो सच्चाई भी पहुंचे और वो intact भी रखे audience को ड्रामे में, मतलब ड्रामा भी create कर पाए.
So I think, like I was saying, I think some of these techniques at least will transfer over to nonfiction as well, right? So meaning that you need to think about in like, suppose you're talking about one character, right? One of these women, one person, then you figure out the same stuff. Who is she? Where does she come from? What does she want, right? And then what are the bumps in her journey along the way? And then along that central line, you arrange your incidents and your scenes, right? And then think about, like, again, how the person is changing from each battle to the next one, as it were. Who is she losing, right? Does her brother get killed, right? What are the cruelties she inflicts on another person? How are those changing her? So I think that would be the way that I would think about it. My great guru in this regard in nonfiction writing is my friend Hussain Zaidi, right? So you must know about him. He's I think of him as the dean of crime writing in India.
Yes, so sir. Yes, sir. I was just reading about him. Yeah.
So his new thing is just coming out, no? Class of '83. Like, he worked on that. It's based on one of his books. So I've learned a lot from him about how to do this kind of nonfiction reporting, right? And we talk about this also in terms of structure, right? In terms of scenes. And I know that in our conversations, we talk about it in a way that is very similar to how we talk about fiction as well, right? So I would point to his writing, and I believe sometimes recently he's been doing online classes or at least lectures that I don't know where they're available, but I know he's on Twitter. I don't know if he's very present on Facebook anymore, but if you do a couple of Google searches, you might find more information about these kind of teaching things that he does. Right?
Sure, sir. Actually, so far I've been writing for audio, and my biggest challenge, there are two challenges. One is screenplay. मतलब मैंने one line story लिख ली है, but I'm like not able to understand how to go about the screenplay, कैसे लिखना है. And the second thing, जब मैं mostly real life characters के नजदीक लिखती हूँ, जो भी चीजें लिखती हूँ, तो जब आप ऐसा कुछ लिखते हो जो आपकी लाइफ में आपने नहीं देखी है चीजें, मतलब इट इज नॉट समथिंग जिस एनवायरनमेंट में मैं रही हूँ या मैंने देखा हो, तो उसकी ऑथेंटिसिटी को बरकरार रखने के लिए मतलब व्हाट इज दोज एक्सरसाइज और R&D और व्हाट सॉर्ट ऑफ जर्नी वन राइटर शुड गो टू अंडरस्टैंड?
हाँ, so this, like you said, R&D तो करना पड़ता है, is essential, and I like doing it sometimes I think to an excessive extent, right? Because I'm an obsessive person. मतलब I dive into these rabbit holes. You can see behind me in this very messy office, all these on the right side, these are all my research materials for the fiction I'm working on now.
Yes, sir.
Right. So what I mean by that is कि, two things. One is that you kind of do reading, right? So you read real life accounts, you read newspaper reports to kind of absorb some kind of factual reporting about from the ground about what happened, who are these people. I end up looking at photographs as well because visually often that can help you. And then the other half, which is sometimes not that easy, is to actually do what I think of as field research, right? So you kind of go out and you talk to people who move in that world, right? And I think when you're writing about crime, that can be a scary kind of experience, right? Because you're dealing with these people. And like I was saying, Hussain, mera bhai, I couldn't have written Sacred Games without him, right? Because he was my guide and philosopher in this world, right? So what happened was that I met him when I was doing Love and Longing. I was doing that first cop story about Sartaj. So I asked my sister Anupma, I don't know anything about this world, but I want to write about it. I'm interested in it. Do you know anybody, journalist who works in this area? And she said, हाँ एक मेरे ध्यान में है, Hussain, and I don't know him so well, but I'll introduce you. So we met up, I think in Juhu, and then we started talking, and then he started introducing me to people. So I got to know some policemen, and then that continued all the way through Sacred Games, the research part of it. So I was doing both things in parallel and then writing also in parallel, right? And then what happens after a while, that at certain points, I have come up with very specific questions, right? Like there's one point in the novel and in the series where I asked the question, how does, we've all heard कि elections चुरा लिए जाते हैं, booths get captured, like what? So I want to know, like, but what is the actual techniques that people use, right? How much do people get paid for this? How many men do you need? What equipment do you need? Although I know some very amazing women reporters who've reported in the field of crime doing precisely this kind of ground research. It's tougher, I think, for women sometimes to get into that world, right? For like all the patriarchal reasons of sexism and all of that. And then the other thing that you said about writing screenplays, I would say the same applies to when I write fiction. One thing to do is when you watch something and it really affects you and you're really taken by it, then what you should do is watch that same thing again and again and again, right? And then once you the first couple of times, because you'll be so captured by it, you won't be able to see the structure, right? You won't be able to see the technique. But if you watch it 10 times, then you start to see the building blocks, right? And then you can analyze them and learn from them, right? So I do this all the time. I've read that Bad Blood, I think 3 times now. I've read Uncanny Valley a couple of times. And it's a pleasure to come back to a really well-made thing, then you can watch it again and again, right? But then I think when you watch it after a certain number of times, then you should apply your analytical brain side also, right? And try and think about kaise banaya, right? How did they manage to get into under my skin so much? And that can be really helpful. It's kind of like learning from the masters, right? You see what they're doing and then you try and think about what they're doing, and then you steal from them, right? Just take the thing and steal it and use it in your own work. Right?
Thank you so much. And thank you, Anupurti.
Yeah.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Can we have Tarini next? Tarini, can you please go ahead and ask a question and introduce yourself?
Thank you. I'm Tarini and I'm currently working as a journalist with StoriesAsia. And we do both text and video stories. So my question is about medium actually. I wanted to ask, what do you think are the biggest differences in writing for the screen and writing for the page? And also what your experience with adaptation from one medium to the other has been?
Yeah, well, so uh, so when I've written fiction all my life, right? And my instinct is for fiction, and I think in very fictional terms. So when I first started, I mean, even at film school, but then a little later on, I to some extent worked on scripts and so on. There were two things that really shocked me at first, and I had a really hard time getting around them. One is that in film and in stage drama, you have no access to the interiority of a character, right? Everything has to be externalized. And one of the great advantages of fiction is that at any point I can say, then Rajesh thought, or I can say Rajesh felt, right? And I can spend like 3 pages inside the character, right? And I don't need to be doing anything else. But in film or in drama, I can't have the guy just sitting there and thinking, right? He has to be doing something to somebody. And you can do monologues, right? Where the guy just turns to the audience and said, this is what I feel, right? But that can become really clumsy and distracting after a while. So this was a big shock to me. I still don't know how to do it properly. The other thing is about length, right? I tend to write very long stuff as it is. But then I was working with Vinod, who's now my brother-in-law, Vidhu, Vinod Chopra, early on 1942, A Love Story, and I would write something, and he would take like 4 pages, and he would draw red lines through like 3 of them, right? Because my dialogue was too long, everything was too long, right? Because in screen time, 2 minutes is enormous length of time, right? But in fiction writing, you are constantly, you can spend lots of time. You can take your time because your novel is like 400 pages, right? So you have that luxury of that length. So that was a big adjustment to me, and I really admire both the theater writers and screenwriters and directors who can make that short space work with so much resonance. And then, like, I guess in terms of adaptation, I think you have to make radical leaps, right? Because it's like translating poetry from one language to another. If you do a literal translation, you will leave behind, you might get some of the meaning across, but you'll leave behind all the poetry, right? So, I mean, just even think about the phrase "kaleje ka tukda," right? If you do a literal translation of that into English, a piece of my liver, it makes no sense, right? It sounds kind of horrifying, right? But so then you have to do that kind of leap. And so I mean, I was very clear when we started working on the Sacred Games adaptation. I was like, acha, it's not what is going to come out is not what I wrote, and happily so, right? These guys have to make huge leaps in order to translate it properly for the film medium, right? And so I knew this because I'd seen the process from the other side, right? And writers who try and maintain too much control, wo pagal ho jate hain. Like that's the way to go crazy, because you're always disappointed. What are you doing to my scene? What are you doing to my characters? And so I was very prepared to let go of the book. Although I have to say that when I first saw the first draft of the first episode of season 1, I was like, what have they done? Right? Like, the characters are completely different. Parulkar is a completely different guy. I mean, he's similar in the sense that he's a great political player. He's very shana, he's very slimy. He completely like understands like everything, how the game is played. But in the book, he's like a substitute father for Sartaj, right? Even though there's tension between them, right? And so I was like, who's this guy that you put on the screen or in the screenplay? And then I realized they had to do it, right? Because you can't like maintain the same characters, maintain the same universe. So finally, like in my head now, the universe of the series is an alternate universe, right? It exists at an angle to the book universe, and that's absolutely fine. and that's why the series was so great, right? Because it didn't stick too closely to what was in the book. And when I think of all the really excellent adaptations from book to film, I think that's true of all of them, right? Necessarily so.
It ended up being a masterclass for all of us.
Thank you. That's very kind of you to say that.
No, thank you.
Like I was saying, I love what you guys are doing, and the ideals towards which you are working. In today's world, those principles are more important than ever. So good work. Onwards and upwards. Don't give up. Right?
Thank you.
Keep on marching.